The chandelier swayed. 300 candles flickered in unison, casting serpentine shadows across the faces of Georgia's finest families as they waltzed beneath the vaulted ceiling of the Langridge Ashfield ballroom. The crystal pendants chimed, a delicate, crystalline song that should have been beautiful. But on this October night in 1827, that sound carried the whisper of something wrong. Cornelius Ashfield noticed it first. The patriarch stood near the refreshment table, champagne flute frozen halfway to his lips, his eyes fixed on the massive iron chandelier that dominated the ballroom's center. 20 feet above the dancers, it moved. Not the gentle sway of air currents, but something deeper, a rhythmic oscillation that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the mansion itself. "Prudence," he called to his wife, but the orchestra drowned his voice. The violins soared through a Viennese waltz while 237 guests spun across the polished oak floor, their silks and satins a blur of emerald, sapphire, and burgundy. They didn't hear the first sound, a low groan that emanated from somewhere within the walls, as if the house had developed a voice and chosen this moment to speak. In the carriage house, 70 yards from the mansion's eastern wing, Robert Thorne watched through the second-story window. His hands rested flat on the windowsill, palms down, fingers spread. Steady. He'd positioned himself here deliberately, this exact window, this precise angle, because it offered an unobstructed view of the ballroom's tall windows. Through the glass, he could see the chandelier. He could see the dancers beneath it. He could see everything he'd spent 18 months engineering. His face revealed nothing. No satisfaction. No anger. No fear. Just the blank, careful expression he'd perfected over 34 years of bondage, the mask that made white men look past him as if he were furniture, as if he possessed no more intelligence than the horses he tended. But Robert Thorne knew things. He knew that the northern support beam, the one concealed behind the pilaster near the musician's alcove, had been cut 3/4 through. He knew that oak beam bore 18,000 pounds when the ballroom stood empty, and perhaps 40,000 pounds tonight, with bodies packed shoulder to shoulder, with servants carrying silver trays laden with roasted quail and syllabub, with the weight of aristocratic certainty pressing down like a physical force. He knew it would fail at any moment. The crack came at 9:47 p.m. Not loud, not yet. Just a sharp report, like a tree branch snapping in winter. But in the ballroom, heads turned. Conversation faltered. The orchestra played on for 3 more measures before the conductor's baton froze mid-arc. Prudence Ashfield's hand flew to her throat, diamonds catching candlelight. Cornelius. The chandelier lurched. Not a sway now, but a violent drop of 3 inches before catching again. Candle wax rained down onto the dancers below. A woman screamed, high, sharp, the sound of prey recognizing the predator. Panic rippled through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water. Guests stumbled backward, creating a void beneath the chandelier even as they pressed toward the ballroom's 3 doorways. But the Langridge Ashfield mansion had been built for grandeur, not escape. Those doorways stood narrow, designed for elegant processions, not desperate flight. Everyone remained calm. Cornelius bellowed, his voice cracking. The structure is sound. The second beam failed. This one on the eastern wall, hidden behind the cream-colored plaster and silk wallpaper imported from Paris. The sound was different, not a crack but a shriek, as 18 months of carefully concealed saw marks gave way all at once. The beam split lengthwise, wood fibers tearing like muscle separating from bone. The floor tilted. Only by inches, but enough. Enough for champagne flutes to slide from tables. Enough for the Meissen porcelain platters to crash against marble. Enough for every person in that ballroom to understand, with the clarity that comes only in moments before death, that the house was eating itself. Robert watched the eastern windows. Through the glass, he saw bodies surge toward the main entrance, saw Thaddeus Ashfield, the eldest son, shoving aside an elderly woman in his desperation to reach the door. Saw Silas Ashfield, the younger son, clawing over the Meriwether family from Baldwin County. Saw Constance Ashfield, the daughter, her engagement ball transformed into a stampede. He watched with the patience of a man who had waited 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days for this moment. The third beam went almost silently, a whisper of wood against wood, deep within the western wall. But its failure triggered something worse. The ballroom floor, that magnificent expanse of white oak laid in a herringbone pattern, began to separate from its joists. Gaps appeared between the boards, first hair-thin, then finger-wide. Through those gaps, the people in the ballroom could see down into the darkness of the crawl space below, where Robert had spent so many Sunday mornings sawing, cutting, weakening. "The floor," someone shrieked. "The floor is." The chandelier fell. Not completely. Not yet. But the chain holding it, wrought iron forged in a Richmond foundry, tested to hold 5,000 pounds, snapped at its weakest link. The massive fixture dropped 10 feet in a heartbeat, then caught again on the secondary chain. It swung like a pendulum now, 300 candles streaming fire, crystal pendants shattering and raining down like glass tears. One pendant caught the light just right as it fell. For a fraction of a second, it threw a rainbow across Prudence Ashfield's face, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, before it struck her temple and opened her skin to the bone. Blood on white marble. The first blood, but not the last. Robert's breathing remained steady. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. The way a coachman breathes when calming a spooked horse. The way a man breathes when he's worked every angle, calculated every variable, and knows exactly what comes next. The fourth beam. The fifth. Both within seconds of each other now, because weight redistribution worked like a falling chain, each failure forcing the remaining beams to bear loads they were never designed to carry. The northern wall's plaster cracked vertically, floor to ceiling, the fissure spreading with the sound of ripping canvas. Behind that plaster, the beam twisted, fibers snapping in progressive sequence, 1,000 small failures becoming one catastrophic collapse. The ballroom's vaulted ceiling, that architectural marvel, that testament to the Ashfield family's wealth and refinement, sagged. First at the center, where the chandelier hung. Then spreading outward in concentric rings, like ripples on water. The fresco painted on that ceiling, depicting Greek gods lounging in Olympian splendor, fractured. Zeus's face split in half. Aphrodite's body separated at the torso. Out! Cornelius Ashfield roared, abandoning all pretense of control. Everyone out. Now. But the doorways had become bottlenecks. Bodies pressed against bodies, silks tearing, bones cracking as the stampede compressed human flesh into spaces too small to contain it. The Talmadge family from Augusta disappeared beneath the crush. The Flournoy family from Sparta clawed over them, trampling without seeing, without caring, animal instinct overriding Georgian civility. In the carriage house window, Robert Thorne finally moved. His right hand rose slowly to his face. His fingers touched the scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw, the scar Thaddeus Ashfield had given him 3 years ago with a riding crop, punishment for looking the young master in the eye. His hand dropped. The sixth beam, the final load-bearing support, the keystone of the entire structure, held for 3 seconds longer than Robert had calculated. He'd accounted for green oak, for moisture content, for the angle of his saw cuts. But he hadn't accounted for the will of inanimate things, for wood's stubborn refusal to surrender. It held. Then it didn't. The sound was nothing like the others. This was the roar of total structural failure, every nail pulling free, every joist separating, every carefully mortised joint disintegrating at once. The ballroom ceiling didn't just fall. It disintegrated. Plaster and lathe and timber and the entire third-floor gallery came down as a single crushing mass, 200 tons of Georgian architecture transformed into a falling sky. Robert saw it through the windows, the moment when the ceiling met the floor, when the 237 guests found themselves caught between. He saw the chandelier finally tear free completely and plunge into the mass of bodies below. He saw the eastern wall bow outward, windows exploding, glass transforming into 1,000 glittering knives. He saw Cornelius Ashfield in the instant before a support column fell across his chest, saw the plantation owner's face turn toward the carriage house, saw recognition flash in those blue eyes. Understanding. Not of the mechanics, but of the intent. Cornelius Ashfield knew, in his final moment, that someone had done this deliberately. The screaming rose above even the roar of collapse, human voices stripped of language, reduced to pure animal terror and agony. The sound would reach the slave quarters a quarter-mile south. It would wake the field hands from their sleep. They would stand in their doorways and listen, not understanding, not yet knowing what gift had been given to them this October night. Robert stepped back from the window. The ballroom still groaned and settled, timbers finding new positions, bodies being crushed by incremental shifts in weight. But the main event had concluded. The rest was aftermath. He walked to the corner of the carriage house and sat on the wooden stool where he'd waited every night for 18 months, planning, refining, perfecting. His hands returned to his lap, palms down, fingers spread. He thought of Delilah, his wife, sold to a Mississippi plantation 2 years ago. He thought of Ruth, his daughter, 7 years old when she was torn from his arms. He thought of the 214 days he'd spent learning the mansion's architecture. He thought of the 53 Sundays he'd spent sawing, 3/4 through, never all the way, always leaving just enough wood to bear the weight until the perfect moment. He thought of justice. 18 months ago, this had begun. 18 months of invisible sabotage, of moving through the Ashfield mansion like a ghost, unnoticed and underestimated. Because that was the greatest weapon bondage had given him, the certainty that free men would never see him clearly, would never credit him with the intelligence to destroy them from within. But they would see now. Everyone would see what an enslaved coachman could accomplish with patience, knowledge, and the quiet rage of a man with nothing left to lose. If you're intrigued by this dark chapter of history, subscribe to stay updated on more macabre stories like this one. And drop a comment below, do you think his actions were justified? Let's discuss. 18 months earlier, April 1826, the Langridge Ashfield plantation stretched across 2,000 acres of Wilkinson County, Georgia, like a kingdom carved from red clay and pine. The main road from Milledgeville wound through cotton fields that rolled white and endless under the spring sun, past the gin house and the smokehouse and the rows of weathered cabins where 243 enslaved people slept on corn-shuck mattresses and dreamed dreams they dared not speak aloud. At the center of this kingdom stood the mansion. 3 stories of whitewashed brick and Charleston green shutters, with 6 Doric columns supporting a double-tiered portico that announced the Ashfield family's arrival into Georgia's planter aristocracy. The house had been built in 1809 by Cornelius Ashfield's father, constructed by enslaved hands using enslaved-fired bricks, every nail and board purchased with money extracted from enslaved labor. 17 years later, the mansion stood as testament to a simple equation: human bondage converted into architectural permanence. The estate took its name from Cornelius's mother, Langridge Beaumont Ashfield, a Charleston belle who died in childbirth and whose memory her husband had immortalized in property deeds and surveyors' maps. Langridge Ashfield. The name appeared on cotton bales shipped to Liverpool, on bills of sale for human beings, on the silver service that graced the dining room table. Robert Thorne had lived on this estate for 12 years. He'd been purchased in 1814 from a Virginia breeder for $800, a premium price justified by his youth, his strength, and his unusual skill with horses. 22 years old then, newly separated from his mother and 2 sisters, sold south like thousands of others when Virginia's tobacco economy faltered and its greatest crop became the people it held in bondage. Cornelius Ashfield had bought him to serve as head coachman, responsible for the family's 4 carriages, 8 carriage horses, and the intricate social choreography that required the master class to arrive at church, at balls, at neighboring plantations in vehicles that proclaimed their status. It was skilled work. Trusted work. The kind of position that carried small privileges, better food, a private room in the carriage house, relative freedom from the overseer's whip. Robert had learned to be grateful for these crumbs. Or at least to appear grateful. He was 34 now, tall and lean, with hands scarred from years of working leather reins and iron bits. His face carried the map of his life, the scar from Thaddeus Ashfield's riding crop, another across his knuckles from a spooked mare, a third along his collarbone from the time Silas Ashfield had thrown a brass candlestick during a drunken rage. But his eyes remained clear, dark, watchful. The eyes of a man who saw everything and revealed nothing. The Ashfield family numbered 5 in the spring of 1826. Cornelius Ashfield, 53 years old, stood as patriarch and absolute authority. He was a large man, 6 feet 2 inches, 240 pounds, with silver-streaked hair and the florid complexion of someone who enjoyed his French wines and Kentucky bourbon. He'd expanded the plantation's holdings by 600 acres since inheriting from his father, purchased 93 additional enslaved people, and positioned himself as a voice of agricultural innovation in the Georgia legislature. He spoke eloquently about soil conservation and crop rotation, about breeding programs for cotton and for humans, about the divine order that placed some men in mansions and others in chains. Prudence Ashfield, his wife of 31 years, presided over the domestic sphere with the precision of a military commander. Born Prudence Whitaker in Savannah, she brought a dowry of 40 enslaved people to the marriage and maintained exacting standards for household management. The mansion's floors must gleam. The silver must shine. The enslaved house servants must move silently, speak softly, and disappear the moment their usefulness concluded. She was 49 years old, handsome rather than beautiful, with steel-gray hair arranged in elaborate curls and a voice that could flay skin without ever rising above conversational volume. Thaddeus Ashfield, the eldest son at 28, had been groomed from birth to inherit the empire. He'd studied at the College of William and Mary in Virginia, returned with refined tastes and unreformed cruelty. He enjoyed hunting, deer, turkey, foxes, and occasionally the enslaved people he pursued through the woods for sport, laughing as they fled, firing his rifle close enough to make them scream but rarely close enough to kill. He wore his blonde hair long, dressed in tailored suits from Charleston tailors, and carried himself with the absolute confidence of a man who'd never faced consequences for anything. Silas Ashfield, 24, served as his father's shadow and his brother's inferior. Shorter, darker, prone to brooding silences and explosive violence, he managed the plantation's financial records and nursed resentments against a world that placed him second in everything. He drank too much, gambled poorly, and took out his frustrations on whoever stood nearest when the rage overwhelmed him. The enslaved people learned to recognize the signs, the clenched jaw, the reddening ears, and scatter before his fists found targets. Constance Ashfield, 19 years old, had been shaped into the perfect ornament of plantation aristocracy. She played pianoforte, spoke passable French, painted watercolors of magnolias and mockingbirds, and smiled vapidly through conversations about topics she'd been taught not to contemplate too deeply. Her engagement to Hamilton Meriwether III of Baldwin County would unite 2 prominent families and expand both estates' holdings. The wedding was planned for June 1827. A grand ball would announce the engagement in October 1826. These were the people who owned Robert Thorne. But ownership, Robert had learned, was a more complicated concept than the law suggested. He rose each morning at 4:30, before the house stirred, and walked from his room in the carriage house to the stable. 8 horses required feeding, watering, grooming, exercising. The carriages needed cleaning, oil for the axles, inspection of every strap and buckle and spoke. By 6 a.m., he had the landau ready if Cornelius required transport to Milledgeville. By 7, the barouche stood prepared for Prudence's social calls. By 8, the phaeton waited for Thaddeus's morning ride. He existed in service to their schedules, their whims, their emergencies real and manufactured. But in the spaces between commands, he watched. He listened. He learned. He learned that Cornelius kept a locked ledger in his study documenting every purchase, every sale, every human being reduced to a line item and a dollar amount. He learned that Prudence maintained extensive correspondence with Charleston merchants, ordering furniture and fabrics and French porcelain that arrived in crates he helped unload. He learned that Thaddeus seduced enslaved women with threats disguised as privileges, and that Silas auctioned off the resulting children when they grew old enough to fetch prices. He learned that the Ashfield family, for all their cultivation and refinement, were monsters. But he'd known monsters before. What he learned in April 1826 was something different. Something that transformed knowledge into action, observation into calculation, patience into rage. Her name was Delilah. They'd married in 1818, jumping the broom in a ceremony the Ashfield family permitted because it cost them nothing and sometimes increased productivity when the enslaved formed stable pairs. Delilah worked in the mansion's kitchen, 40 hours a week bent over a massive hearth, roasting meats and baking bread and preparing the elaborate meals that graced the Ashfield table. She had strong hands, a quick mind, and a voice that sang hymns on Sunday mornings with such beauty that even the white family sometimes paused to listen. Ruth had been born in 1819. Their daughter. 7 pounds, 3 ounces, with Delilah's eyes and Robert's stubborn chin. She grew up in the kitchen, learning to knead dough at 4, to pluck chickens at 5, to read her mother's expressions and know when to be invisible. She was 6 years old when Cornelius Ashfield decided he needed capital. The cotton market had fallored in 1823. Prices dropped. Cornelius had expanded too aggressively, purchased too much land, owed too much to Savannah factors. He needed cash immediately, and the quickest route to liquidity ran through the bodies he owned. On March 14, 1824, he sold 43 people. Delilah and Ruth were numbers 17 and 18 on the manifest. Robert had learned about the sale 2 days before it happened, overheard Cornelius discussing prices with a Mississippi speculator who'd arrived in a wagon with iron shackles already prepared. He'd gone to Cornelius that night, knelt in the study, begged. Offered to work without food. Offered to purchase them himself somehow, someway. Offered anything. Cornelius had laughed. Actually laughed. You want to buy them, Robert? With what currency? You own nothing. You are nothing. You're a useful piece of property, and they're surplus to current needs. Be grateful I'm not selling you. Thaddeus had been present for this conversation. He'd smiled, that particular smile Robert had learned to recognize, the expression of a man enjoying another's suffering. Father, I have an idea. Make Robert drive them to the auction house. Let him deliver them personally. Cornelius had considered this. Educational, he'd finally said. Yes. Robert, you'll transport the surplus to Milledgeville. Consider it a lesson in the natural order. So Robert had hitched the wagon on March 16, 1824. He'd driven 43 people 22 miles to the auction house on Jefferson Street. Delilah and Ruth sat in the wagon bed, Ruth crying, Delilah silent, her hand gripping Robert's shoulder through the wooden slats. At the auction house, a speculator from Natchez, Mississippi, purchased them both for $900 combined. Breeding age woman, young female child with potential. The speculator chained them immediately, iron around Delilah's neck, a smaller collar for Ruth, and led them to a coffle heading west. Robert had watched until they disappeared around the corner. Then he'd driven the empty wagon back to Langridge Ashfield, unhitched the horses, and returned to his room in the carriage house. He'd knelt beside his bed that night and discovered something: he had no more prayers. God, if God existed, had abandoned this place. The hymns Delilah sang, the Bible verses the white preacher read every Sunday about servants obeying masters, the promises of heaven compensating for earthly suffering, all of it was a lie designed to make the unbearable seem inevitable. Robert stood up from his knees and made a different kind of vow. He would destroy them. Not immediately. Not rashly. But completely. He would wait for the perfect opportunity, gather the necessary knowledge, and bring down everything the Ashfield family had built on the foundation of stolen lives. 2 years passed. 730 days of appearing docile, of saying, yes, master, and, right away, master, and absorbing every casual cruelty as if it meant nothing. But during those 730 days, Robert learned patience more profound than any the Ashfields could imagine. He learned their routines, their blind spots, their assumptions. He learned that they considered him intelligent enough to manage complex tasks but not intelligent enough to threaten them. They trusted him with their horses, their vehicles, their children's transportation. They sent him on errands to neighboring plantations, gave him access to tools, allowed him to move through spaces where other enslaved people couldn't go. They handed him the weapons of their own destruction and never noticed. In April 1826, opportunity arrived in the form of architectural ambition. Cornelius Ashfield decided to expand the mansion. Constance's engagement to Hamilton Meriwether III required a grand gesture, a statement of the family's ascending status. He hired an architect from Augusta, Lawrence Whitmore, a man who'd studied briefly in Philadelphia and brought plans for a ballroom addition that would transform the mansion into one of Wilkinson County's finest estates. The ballroom would occupy the mansion's eastern wing. 40 feet long, 30 feet wide, with a vaulted ceiling rising 16 feet at its apex. A chandelier imported from Paris would hang at the center, and the room would accommodate 200 guests comfortably. Construction would take 8 months, beginning in May 1826 and concluding in January 1827. The engagement ball would occur in October 1827, giving the family time to issue invitations across Georgia's planter class. Robert had stood in the yard when Cornelius announced the project, and something had shifted behind his sternum. A gear catching, a mechanism engaging. This was the opportunity. He didn't know exactly how yet. But watching the architect unroll blueprints on the portico, seeing the massive timbers arrive on freight wagons, observing the foundation being laid, Robert understood that this ballroom would become the Ashfield family's tomb. He just needed to learn how to build it. Lawrence Whitmore arrived at Langridge Ashfield on May 3, 1826, driving a wagon loaded with tools, lumber samples, and architectural drawings that represented 6 months of correspondence with Cornelius Ashfield. He was 42 years old, a barrel-chested man with calloused hands and ink-stained fingers, wearing a linen shirt that had seen better days and carrying the confidence of someone who understood how buildings stood up and, more importantly, what made them fall down. Robert met him at the carriage circle, helping unload the wagon while Cornelius and Thaddeus hovered nearby, eager to see the plans transformed into reality. Whitmore barely glanced at Robert, another pair of hands, another nameless enslaved laborer, invisible in the way tools became invisible once you'd used them long enough. This invisibility would prove fatal to the Ashfield family. The construction crew arrived 2 days later, 8 white carpenters from Milledgeville and Sparta, skilled tradesmen who commanded daily wages that made Cornelius wince even as he signed the contracts. They'd frame the addition, install the load-bearing beams, construct the vaulted ceiling, and complete the finish work that would transform raw lumber into architectural elegance. But they needed laborers. Men to carry timbers, mix mortar, hold lanterns in crawl spaces, fetch tools from the wagon. Cornelius assigned 5 enslaved men to the project, rotating them as needed from field work. Robert was among them. "You're strong, you follow instructions, and you won't steal my tools," Whitmore had said on the first morning, addressing the group of enslaved laborers without really looking at them. "Do what you're told, stay out of the way when we're doing precision work, and we'll finish this project on schedule." Robert nodded with the others, his face carefully blank. The education began immediately. Whitmore was a teacher by nature, one of those craftsmen who couldn't help explaining his work even when his audience consisted of people he didn't consider fully human. He thought aloud, narrated his decisions, demonstrated techniques while describing the principles behind them. He did this for the benefit of his white crew, but Robert stood close enough to hear everything. On the first day, Whitmore walked the construction site with his lead carpenter, a taciturn man named Gideon Phelps from Athens. They surveyed the eastern wing where the ballroom would attach to the existing structure, and Whitmore pointed at the mansion's brick walls with his measuring stick. "Foundation looks solid," he said. "Brick construction, laid in Flemish bond, good mortar. But we're adding significant weight, the ballroom floor, the ceiling structure, the gallery on the 3rd floor. The existing walls weren't designed to bear this load. So we add support beams," Phelps said. "Exactly. 6 primary load-bearing beams, oak, 12 by 12 inches, running the full width of the ballroom. 3 will support the floor joists, 3 will support the ceiling joists. We distribute the weight across these beams, and the beams transfer it to the foundation and the exterior walls. Robert, holding a coil of rope nearby, listened. What about the vaulted ceiling? Phelps asked. Whitmore unrolled a blueprint on a makeshift table, 2 sawhorses and a plank. Robert edged closer, pretending to adjust his grip on the rope, his eyes tracking the lines and measurements on the paper. The vault requires a different approach, Whitmore said, tracing the arc with his finger. We'll use a system of curved ribs, 7 of them, spaced 5 feet apart, with cross-bracing between them. But the critical supports are here, here, and here. He tapped 3 points on the blueprint. These 3 ceiling beams bear the entire weight of the vault and the third-floor gallery above it. If these fail, the whole ceiling comes down. Heavy timber, then. The heaviest. White oak, green cut, 12 by 14 inches. We'll set them on these pilasters, he indicated decorative columns on the blueprint, which are actually structural supports disguised as ornamentation. The Ashfields want beauty, but beauty requires bones. Robert's mind recorded every word. 6 primary beams. 3 for the floor, 3 for the ceiling. 12 by 12 inches. 12 by 14 inches. White oak. The beams would be hidden, behind plaster, behind decorative pilasters, inside walls where they became invisible to everyone except the men who built them. And the men who wanted to destroy them. Over the following weeks, Robert made himself indispensable to the construction. He arrived early, before the white carpenters, and prepared the site, swept sawdust, organized tools, laid out materials in the order they'd be needed. He stayed late, holding lanterns while Whitmore inspected the day's work, cleaning up after the crew departed. He volunteered for every task that placed him near Whitmore, near the blueprints, near the technical conversations. Robert, hold this level while I mark the beam placement, Whitmore would say, and Robert would hold the level while watching exactly where Whitmore made his marks, understanding that these marks indicated where the beams would bear maximum load. Robert, climb down into the crawl space and tell me if you can see daylight through the foundation, and Robert would descend into the darkness beneath the mansion, mapping the network of support posts and crossbeams that held the first floor aloft, memorizing the layout for future reference. Robert, carry these plans to the porch so I can show Mr. Ashfield the progress, and Robert would carry the blueprints carefully, his eyes drinking in every detail during the 30-second walk, committing measurements and specifications to memory. He learned that the northern support beam, the first one installed, on May 18, 1826, carried the greatest load because it bore the weight of the ballroom floor at its widest point. This beam was positioned behind what would become the musician's alcove, concealed by a decorative pilaster that Prudence Ashfield had selected from a catalogue of classical designs. He learned that the eastern and western beams supported the floor's edges and transferred weight to the exterior walls. These beams were embedded directly into the brick, their ends mortared in place, creating a connection that Whitmore described as permanent as the mansion itself. He learned that the 3 ceiling beams, the true keystones of the entire structure, were even more critical. They supported not only the vaulted ceiling's curved ribs but also the third-floor gallery that Cornelius had insisted be incorporated into the design. This gallery would allow observers to look down into the ballroom during grand events, a theatrical flourish that added another 8,000 pounds of structural load. The ceiling beams are the heart of this project, Whitmore explained to Cornelius during an inspection in late June. Robert stood 10 feet away, holding a bucket of nails, absolutely still. If they're properly installed, this ballroom will stand for 200 years. The oak is green cut, which means it's still seasoning, still contracting slightly. As it dries, it becomes harder, denser, stronger. By next year, these beams will be nearly indestructible. Nearly indestructible. Robert filed this information away. He also learned about failure points, the places where structures became vulnerable. Whitmore was cautious by nature, constantly checking and rechecking his work, and he narrated his concerns aloud. "The worst failure in construction is beam collapse," he told Gideon Phelps one afternoon while Robert mixed mortar nearby. "If a beam fails catastrophically, everything it supports comes down instantly. That's why we over-engineer, use timber twice as strong as necessary, add redundant supports, never rely on a single load path." "What causes beam failure?" Phelps asked. "Several things. Rot, usually, but that takes years. Improper installation, if the beam isn't seated correctly on its supports. Fire. Or structural damage, if someone were to saw partially through a beam, compromise its integrity, it might hold for a while under normal loads but fail catastrophically under stress." "Who would saw through a beam?" Whitmore laughed. "Saboteurs, I suppose. During the War of 1812, there were stories of British sympathizers weakening American fortifications. But in civilian construction? Never happens. The beams are hidden inside walls, inaccessible once the plaster goes up." Robert's hands continued mixing mortar in steady circles. "Inaccessible once the plaster goes up." He committed this to memory too. The ballroom's framing progressed through summer. By August, all 6 primary beams were installed, and Robert had helped position each one, had felt their weight as he and 5 other men maneuvered the massive timbers into place, had watched Whitmore mark the exact placement, had observed the carpenters secure them with iron brackets and oak pegs. He knew where every beam was located. He'd touched them all. In September, the white carpenters began installing the floor joists, smaller beams, 2 by 10 inches, spaced 16 inches apart, running perpendicular to the 3 floor support beams. Whitmore insisted on precise measurements, checking each joist with his level, ensuring perfect alignment. "The floor must be absolutely flat," he explained to Thaddeus, who'd stopped by to monitor progress. "Any deviation shows when you're laying the finished oak planks. More importantly, an uneven floor indicates structural problems, beams settling incorrectly, joists bearing uneven loads. Precision in framing prevents catastrophe later." By October, the ceiling work began. This was the most complex phase, requiring the curved ribs to be shaped, installed, and braced before the ceiling beams could be finalized. Whitmore spent hours in the space that would become the ballroom, calculating angles, adjusting measurements, muttering to himself about stress loads and weight distribution. Robert volunteered to work night shifts, holding lanterns while Whitmore inspected the ceiling structure. The architect appreciated this. Good light was essential for precision work, and Robert held the lantern steady, never wavering, never complaining about the hours. During these night sessions, Whitmore sometimes spoke more freely, perhaps because darkness created intimacy, or perhaps because he'd convinced himself that Robert understood nothing beyond basic instructions. "The elegant thing about this design," Whitmore said one November evening, holding his measuring stick against a ceiling beam, "is that everything depends on everything else. The beams support the joists support the floor and ceiling, the floor and ceiling create the space. It's a unified system." "Beautiful, really." "Yes, sir," Robert said softly. "Of course, unified systems have a weakness. If one element fails, the failure cascades. Like dominoes. But that's theoretical. With proper construction, properly seasoned oak, proper maintenance, this structure will outlive everyone currently breathing." Robert adjusted the lantern angle to illuminate the beam better. "See this beam here?" Whitmore tapped the northern ceiling support. "This one carries the greatest ceiling load because the vault is highest at this point. I specified 12 by 14 oak, but I could have used 12 by 12. The extra 2 inches is pure insurance, margin of safety. That's the mark of quality construction." "How much weight does it carry, sir?" Robert asked. The question was bold, but Whitmore was in a talkative mood. "Under normal conditions? About 18,000 pounds. During an event like the engagement ball they're planning, with 200 people in the room? Perhaps 40,000 pounds total, distributed across all 6 beams. But each beam is rated for 60,000 pounds. We could fill this room with lead shot and they'd hold 40,000 pounds distributed across 6 beams. Robert's mind performed calculations. If the 6 beams failed, 40,000 pounds would fall. 200 people would be crushed beneath timber, plaster, and the weight of the third-floor gallery. "Thank you for explaining, sir," Robert said. "You're welcome," Whitmore replied absently, returning to his measurements. By December, the ballroom structure was complete. The white carpenters began the finish work, installing the oak flooring, applying plaster to the walls and ceiling, painting the decorative moldings, hanging the imported chandelier. This was detail work, requiring fewer laborers, and Robert was rotated back to full-time carriage house duties. But he'd learned everything he needed. He knew that 6 beams held the ballroom aloft. He knew their exact locations, hidden now behind plaster and paint but mapped precisely in his memory. He knew how much weight they carried, how they distributed loads, how they formed a unified system where one failure would trigger others. He knew that the beams were oak, 12 by 12 or 12 by 14 inches, green cut and still seasoning, growing harder every month. He knew that sawing through a beam would compromise its structural integrity, that a beam cut 3/4 through would appear sound but fail under stress. He knew that the beams were inaccessible once the plaster went up, that no one would inspect them unless they had reason to suspect damage. He knew all of this because Lawrence Whitmore had taught him. The architect departed Langridge Ashfield on January 15, 1827, his work complete, his invoice paid in full. He shook Cornelius's hand, accepted compliments on the ballroom's beauty, and drove away in his wagon, pleased with a job well done. He never learned that he'd trained the instrument of the Ashfield family's destruction. On January 16, 1827, Robert stood in the carriage house and looked across the yard at the completed ballroom. The windows glowed with candlelight. Prudence was hosting a small gathering to show off the new addition. Through the glass, he could see guests admiring the vaulted ceiling, the chandelier, the polished floors. He thought about Delilah, 2 years and 10 months gone now. He thought about Ruth, 8 years old, working in a Mississippi kitchen or a Mississippi field, her childhood stolen, her future foreclosed. He thought about Whitmore's words, "This structure will outlive everyone currently breathing." Not if Robert could help it. He had 9 months before the engagement ball. 9 months to plan, to prepare, to saw through beams hidden behind plaster. 9 months to transform architectural knowledge into architectural murder. He returned to his room and began calculating exactly how much of each beam he'd need to cut, and precisely when he'd need to do it to ensure the collapse occurred at the perfect moment, when the ballroom was full, when the Ashfield family and their aristocratic friends were celebrating, when maximum casualties would send maximum message. The architect's education was complete. Now the real work would begin. Before we continue with Robert's calculated plan, take a moment to subscribe if you appreciate deep dives into history's darkest moments. Comment below with your thoughts so far. The first cut happened on Sunday, February 4, 1827, at 9:17 a.m. Robert knelt in the crawl space beneath the ballroom floor, a crosscut saw in his right hand, listening. Above him, the Ashfield family had departed for services at Shiloh Baptist Church in Milledgeville, a weekly ritual that consumed 4 hours between travel, worship, and the obligatory socializing afterward. The enslaved people left behind on the plantation enjoyed their own Sunday morning freedom, a few hours to tend their garden plots, mend clothes, rest their bodies from the week's brutality. Robert had told the others he was repairing a broken wheel on the landau. No one questioned this. The coachman maintained the vehicles, it was his domain, his responsibility. The crawl space was 3 feet high, dirt floor, thick with spider webs and the smell of clay and rot. Winter light filtered through gaps in the foundation's ventilation bricks, casting pale stripes across the network of support posts and crossbeams that held the mansion's first floor aloft. Robert had entered through an access panel in the carriage house cellar, a route he'd scouted weeks earlier, memorizing every turn, every obstruction, every potential sound that might betray his presence. He'd chosen the northern floor beam for his first cut. This beam supported the ballroom floor at its widest point, bore the greatest load, and was positioned behind the musician's alcove where decorative pilasters concealed it from view. Even if someone removed the plaster, the beam's far side remained hidden against the brick exterior wall. Perfect invisibility. The beam measured 12 inches by 12 inches, white oak, now seasoned for 8 months since installation. The wood had darkened, contracted slightly, hardened into something that would require serious effort to cut. Robert had tested the saw on scrap oak in the carriage house, learning the rhythm, long, steady strokes, letting the blade's weight and sharpness do the work, never forcing, never rushing. He positioned himself perpendicular to the beam, found his angle, and began. The saw bit into oak with a whisper. Not silent, but quiet enough that the sound disappeared into the ambient noise of the plantation, birdsong, distant voices from the slave quarters, wind moving through pine trees. Robert counted strokes. 15. 20. 30. Sawdust accumulated at his knees, pale against the dark clay. He cut from the side facing the crawl space's interior, where no one would ever look unless they were specifically searching for damage. The far side, visible only by crawling to the beam's opposite end and contorting into an impossible position, he left untouched. This created asymmetry, 3/4 of the beam's thickness compromised, 1/4 intact, enough wood remaining to bear normal loads but insufficient to handle stress. After 90 strokes, he'd penetrated 9 inches deep into the 12-inch beam. 3/4 through. He stopped, tested the cut with his fingers, felt the groove smooth and precise. The remaining 3 inches of solid oak would hold. For now. The critical innovation was concealment. Robert had prepared a paste, wood shavings from the carriage house, mixed with soot from the blacksmith's forge, combined with rendered animal fat to create a putty that matched the beam's aged color. He packed this paste into the cut, smoothing it with his thumb, pressing it deep until the saw marks disappeared. From even 2 feet away, the beam appeared untouched. The entire operation took 43 minutes. Robert backed out of the crawl space, replaced the access panel, returned to the carriage house. He cleaned the saw meticulously, removing every trace of fresh sawdust, and hung it on its designated hook. Then he actually did repair the landau's wheel, removed it, replaced a worn spoke, reattached it, so that if anyone asked about his morning, he could show completed work. No one asked. The Ashfield family returned from church at 1:30 p.m., and Robert helped Prudence descend from the barouche, his face carefully neutral as she complained about the sermon's length. That evening, he served dinner in the mansion, carrying platters from the kitchen to the dining room, invisible in the way enslaved servants became invisible, hearing Cornelius discuss cotton prices and Thaddeus boast about a fox hunt. He went to bed that night and slept soundly. 1 beam cut. 5 more to go. The second cut happened 3 weeks later, February 25, 1827, during another Sunday morning church exodus. This time Robert targeted the eastern floor beam, the one embedded in the brick wall, supporting the ballroom's eastern edge. This cut was more difficult. The beam's end was mortared into the wall, and Robert had to work from an awkward angle, lying on his side in the cramped space, sawing upward. His shoulders burned. His neck cramped. But he maintained the rhythm, long strokes, steady pressure, counting to track progress. When he finished, he'd created another 9-inch cut in the 12-inch beam. Another wound packed with wood paste and soot, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. 2 beams compromised. 4 remaining. He established a pattern, 1 cut every 3 to 4 weeks, always on Sunday mornings, always during the church service window. This spacing served multiple purposes. It prevented anyone from noticing a pattern of absence. It gave him time to prepare the wood paste, to scout the crawl space, to ensure each cut was perfect before proceeding to the next. It also built anticipation. Each cut brought him closer to the moment when the ballroom, that symbol of Ashfield wealth and power, would collapse under its own corrupted weight. The third cut, on March 18, targeted the western floor beam. This one proved easiest, accessible from a relatively open section of crawl space, requiring no contortion. Robert completed it in 37 minutes, packed the cut with paste, and was back in the carriage house before the church bells stopped ringing in Milledgeville. 3-floor beams sabotaged. The ballroom's foundation was now compromised, though it showed no signs. People walked across those floors daily, Prudence inspecting the house servants dusting, Constance practicing her pianoforte, Thaddeus hosting card games with visiting friends. The oak held their weight, bore their footsteps, revealed nothing. But Robert knew. Every time he entered the mansion, every time he glimpsed the ballroom through its open doors, he saw not the elegant space but the hidden wounds he'd inflicted. The knowledge sat in his chest like a coal, warm, constant, waiting to ignite. April brought a complication. Cornelius decided to host a spring gathering, not as grand as the October engagement ball, but significant enough to test the ballroom's capacity. 60 guests, a string quartet, dancing and refreshments. Robert felt his pulse quicken when he heard the announcement. 60 people. Perhaps 8,000 pounds of human weight, plus furniture, plus the musician's platform. Would 3 compromised floor beams hold? The mathematics suggested yes. Each beam was rated for 60,000 pounds. Even cut 3/4 through, they retained perhaps 40% of their load-bearing capacity, still 24,000 pounds per beam. The floor's weight would distribute across all 3 beams, none bearing more than 5,000 pounds. The beams would hold. They had to hold. Because Robert's plan required precision. The collapse must occur during the engagement ball in October, when the ballroom would be packed with 200 guests, when the Ashfield family's entire social circle would be present, when maximum destruction would send the clearest message about the cost of stealing lives. The spring gathering proceeded on April 14, 1827. Robert watched from the carriage house as guests arrived, as they entered the ballroom, as the music began and the dancing commenced. He listened for sounds of structural failure, creaking, groaning, anything suggesting the beams couldn't bear the load. Silence. The ballroom held. The guests departed at midnight, none aware they'd danced above Robert's handiwork, none suspecting the floor beneath their feet was fractionally closer to catastrophic failure. Robert exhaled and returned to his calculations. The ceiling beams remained untouched. These were more critical, more dangerous to sabotage. They supported not only the vaulted ceiling but also the third-floor gallery, 16,000 pounds of structural weight plus whatever human weight occupied the gallery during events. They were also more difficult to access. The crawl space provided entry to the floor beams, but the ceiling beams sat 10 feet above the ballroom floor, hidden behind decorative plaster. To reach them, Robert would need to access the second-floor spaces adjacent to the ballroom, remove sections of wall, saw through beams in positions where discovery was more likely. Higher risk. But necessary. He began scouting routes in May. The mansion's second floor contained bedrooms, a library, a sewing room, and various storage closets. The Ashfield family occupied these spaces regularly, but patterns emerged. Sunday mornings, everyone departed for church. Tuesday afternoons, Prudence hosted a ladies' sewing circle in town and Cornelius traveled to Milledgeville for legislative sessions. Thaddeus and Silas kept irregular schedules, but they rarely entered the storage closets. Robert had legitimate reasons to access the second floor. He sometimes helped house servants move furniture, delivered trunks when family members traveled, assisted with repairs the white handyman couldn't complete alone. His presence in the mansion's upper levels raised no suspicions. On Sunday, May 20th, he made his first attempt on a ceiling beam. The northern ceiling beam, the one bearing the greatest vault load, was accessible from a storage closet behind the second-floor gallery. Robert entered this closet at 9:30 a.m., closed the door, and examined the wall. The plaster was thick, applied over wooden lath, painted cream to match the rest of the mansion's interior. He'd brought a small pry bar, wrapped in cloth to muffle sound. Working slowly, he removed a 2-foot section of plaster and lath near the floor, exposing the beam behind it. The oak was massive, 12 by 14 inches, darker than the floor beams, harder from additional seasoning. He positioned his saw and began cutting. The angle was brutal. He had to kneel, reach into the narrow gap between the beam and the brick wall, and saw horizontally. His wrists protested. His back spasmed. But he maintained rhythm, counting strokes, measuring progress by the accumulation of sawdust at his knees. After 2 hours, he'd cut 10.5 inches into the 14-inch beam. 3/4 through. He packed the cut with wood paste, replaced the plaster and lath, and used additional paste to seal the gaps in the wall. From 3 feet away, the repair was invisible. 1 ceiling beam compromised. 2 remaining. June brought oppressive heat. The Georgia summer settled over Wilkinson County like a wool blanket soaked in water, 95 degrees, humidity thick enough to chew, air that barely moved even when the wind blew. Working in the cramped spaces behind walls became torture. Robert's clothes soaked through with sweat within minutes. He had to pause frequently to prevent dizziness, to let his vision clear, to gulp water from a hidden flask. But he continued. On June 17, he sabotaged the eastern ceiling beam, the one supporting the vault's eastern arc. This cut required accessing a bedroom that Constance occasionally used for afternoon reading. Robert waited until she departed for a garden party at the Meriwether estate, then slipped into the room, removed plaster behind an armoire, and spent 90 minutes sawing through oak. 2 ceiling beams down. 1 floor beam remaining. 1 ceiling beam remaining. July brought a crisis. Cornelius hired a maintenance contractor, a free black carpenter named Tobias Fletcher from Milledgeville, to inspect the mansion's structural integrity before the October ball. Fletcher was thorough, knowledgeable, exactly the kind of person who might notice irregularities. Robert's heart hammered when he heard about the inspection. If Fletcher examined the beams, if he noticed the wood paste concealing the cuts, if he investigated further, the entire plan would collapse before the ballroom did. For 3 days, Fletcher crawled through the mansion, checking foundations, examining beams from the cellar, testing floors for levelness. Robert shadowed him when possible, volunteering to hold lanterns, to fetch tools, to assist in any way that kept him close enough to monitor Fletcher's observations. Fletcher found nothing. The wood paste held. The cuts remained invisible. The beams appeared sound. On the inspection's final day, Fletcher submitted his report to Cornelius: structure is sound. No signs of rot, pest damage, or structural compromise. The ballroom addition was expertly constructed and should serve the family for generations. Robert stood nearby, holding Fletcher's toolbox, his face blank. "Excellent," Cornelius said. "I'll sleep better knowing we can host 200 guests without concern." Fletcher departed, paid in full, satisfied with his work. Robert returned to his sabotage. August 12, 1827. Sunday morning, 9 a.m. The western ceiling beam. This was the final major cut, the last structural element requiring sabotage before the engagement ball in October. Robert accessed it through a second-floor linen closet, removed plaster, and spent 2.5 hours sawing through 14 inches of seasoned oak. His hands blistered. His shoulders burned. But when he finished, he'd created a 10.5-inch cut in the beam, 3/4 through, packed with paste, concealed behind replaced plaster. 5 beams compromised. 1 remaining. The 6th beam, the western floor beam, was technically the easiest, but by September, Robert was exhausted. 18 months of secret work, of moving through confined spaces, of maintaining absolute discipline in both action and expression, had worn him down to something harder and more focused than the man he'd been when Delilah and Ruth disappeared. He completed the final cut on September 9, 1827. 33 days before the engagement ball. All 6 primary load-bearing beams were now compromised. Each cut precisely 3/4 through. Each cut concealed by wood paste and soot. Each cut invisible unless you knew where to look and were willing to remove plaster to investigate. The ballroom appeared perfect. The floors gleamed. The vaulted ceiling soared. The chandelier caught afternoon light and threw rainbows across cream-colored walls. Prudence entertained guests there weekly, and they universally praised the addition's elegance. No one knew they were standing inside a tomb. Robert spent the final weeks preparing mentally. He reviewed his calculations obsessively: weight loads, failure sequences, the cascade effect that would occur when the first beam gave way. He designed this collapse with surgical precision. The northern floor beam would fail first under maximum load, triggering weight redistribution that would overload the eastern and western floor beams. Those failures would destabilize the ceiling structure, causing the three ceiling beams to fail in rapid succession. The entire sequence would take perhaps 15 seconds from first crack to total collapse. 40,000 pounds of timber, plaster, and gallery would fall onto 200 guests who'd have no time to escape, no space to run, nowhere to hide from the avalanche of wood and iron, and architectural hubris transformed into gravitational vengeance. On October 11, 1827, the day before the ball, Robert made a final inspection. He entered the ballroom alone. Prudence had dismissed the house servants early, wanting the space pristine for the following evening. He walked the perimeter, studying the walls that concealed his cuts, the floor that hid the wounds beneath. He thought about Delilah, 3 years and 7 months gone. He thought about Ruth, 9 years old now, somewhere in Mississippi, maybe alive, maybe dead, certainly broken by the machinery of slavery. He thought about justice, and how it sometimes required monstrous actions from ordinary men. He left the ballroom and returned to the carriage house. Tomorrow, the Ashfield family would host their engagement ball. Tomorrow, Robert Thorne would show them what an enslaved coachman could accomplish when given 18 months, a saw, and nothing left to lose. October 12, 1827, dawned clear and cool across Wilkinson County, one of those perfect autumn days when Georgia shrugged off summer's oppression and offered a glimpse of seasonal grace. The sky stretched cloudless and blue above the Langridge Ashfield estate, and by noon the temperature had settled at a comfortable 72 degrees. Perfect weather for a grand ball. Robert rose at 4:30 a.m., as always, and began his morning routine. Feed the horses. Check the carriages. Prepare for the day's transportation demands. But his hands moved with unusual precision, his mind cataloging every detail as if committing the morning to permanent memory. This was the last ordinary day of his life. By 10 a.m., servants swarmed the mansion like ants preparing a colony for winter. The ballroom received final touches: fresh flowers arranged in crystal vases, candles positioned in the chandeliers and wall sconces, champagne glasses polished until they caught light like diamonds. The kitchen operated at crisis capacity, preparing delicacies that would feed 200 aristocrats: roasted venison, glazed ham, oysters shipped from Savannah packed in ice, syllabub and trifles, and elaborate pastries constructed from sugar and vanity. Robert hitched the barouche at 11 a.m. and drove Prudence and Constance to Milledgeville for last-minute errands: ribbons that matched Constance's gown, additional champagne that Prudence suddenly decided was essential. He sat on the driver's bench, reins loose in his hands, watching the road unspool ahead while the two women chattered behind him about guest lists and seating arrangements. "Hamilton's family will arrive at 7, Constance said, her voice bright with anticipation. His mother requested a viewing of the ballroom before the other guests arrive. She wants to ensure everything meets her standards." "The Merriweathers have standards," Prudence replied dryly. "Whether they have taste remains debatable. But we'll accommodate them. This ball announces your engagement to Georgia society, everything must be flawless." Flawless. Robert's fingers tightened on the reins, then relaxed. They returned to the estate at 2 p.m., and Robert spent the afternoon preparing the carriage fleet for guest transport. Some families would arrive in their own vehicles, but others, particularly those from Milledgeville, Augusta, and Sparta, had arranged for Langridge Ashfield carriages to collect them. Robert would make 3 trips: a 5 p.m. departure to collect the Talmadge family from Augusta, a 6 p.m. trip for the Flournoy family from Sparta, and a 7 p.m. collection of elderly guests from Milledgeville who couldn't manage their own transportation. Standard work. Ordinary tasks. Nothing to suggest this evening would end in massacre. At 4:30 p.m., Robert bathed in the trough behind the carriage house, washing away the day's dust and sweat. He dressed in the formal livery required for grand occasions: black trousers, white shirt, black waistcoat, black coat with the Ashfield crest embroidered on the breast. He looked at himself in the small mirror hanging on his room's wall and saw a stranger, a man dressed as a servant, prepared to facilitate an evening of celebration, carrying in his chest the knowledge of imminent slaughter. He felt nothing. No guilt. No excitement. No fear. Just the steady certainty that tonight, the calculations would become reality. The first guests arrived at 6:15 p.m. as the sun began its descent toward the pine-covered horizon. Carriages rolled up the oak-lined drive, depositing families dressed in their finest, men in tailcoats and cravats, women in silk gowns with elaborate bustles and gloves that reached their elbows. The Ashfield family received them in the main foyer, all smiles and gracious welcomes, directing them toward the ballroom where champagne and light refreshments awaited. Robert completed his 7 p.m. transport run and returned to find the estate transformed. Lanterns hung from trees along the drive, candles glowed in every mansion window, and music drifted from the ballroom, a string quartet playing Mozart while guests mingled and conversation rose in cultured waves. He positioned himself in the carriage house's second floor, in the room that served as his private quarters. The window faced east, offering an unobstructed view of the ballroom's tall windows. From here, he could see everything: the chandelier blazing with 300 candles, the guests in their finery, the servants circulating with silver trays, the Ashfield family radiating proprietary pride. From here, he would watch the structure he'd spent 18 months sabotaging finally surrender to mathematics and gravity. By 8 p.m., the ballroom was filled beyond capacity. Prudence had invited 180 families, but Georgian hospitality meant those invitations extended to grown children, visiting relatives, and close friends. The actual count exceeded 230 people, their combined weight pressing down on the compromised floor beams with inexorable force. Robert had calculated this. He'd counted on Southern excess, on the inability of plantation aristocrats to decline spectacle. Every additional body increased the load, brought the beams closer to their failure threshold. At 8:30 p.m., the formal dancing began. The string quartet launched into a waltz, and couples took the floor, young men and women performing the careful choreography of courtship, older couples moving with practiced grace, the entire ballroom transforming into a swirl of color and motion. Weight shifted. Redistributed. Concentrated in patterns that changed with each turn, each step, each movement of the dance. The beams groaned, but the sound disappeared beneath music and conversation. At 9 p.m., Cornelius Ashfield called for silence. The music stopped. Conversations faltered. 237 people turned their attention to the patriarch standing on a small platform at the ballroom's northern end. "Dear friends and family," Cornelius began, his voice carrying across the space. "We gather tonight to celebrate a union that brings together two of Georgia's finest families. My daughter Constance and Hamilton Meriwether III will wed next June, and their marriage represents not merely the joining of two young people, but the continuation of traditions that have made our state great." Applause rippled through the crowd. Constance blushed prettily, standing beside Hamilton, a tall young man with carefully groomed sideburns and the entitled bearing of someone who'd never faced consequences for anything. "The Ashfield family has been blessed," Cornelius continued. "Blessed with land, with prosperity, with the wisdom to maintain the proper order of society. This ballroom stands as testament to what can be accomplished when men of vision and industry apply themselves to creation. I built this room for my daughter, but I built it also as a statement that Langridge Ashfield represents the apex of Georgian achievement." More applause. Champagne glasses raised in toast. Prideful faces gleaming in candlelight. Robert watched from his window, 70 yards away, and thought, "You built nothing. Enslaved hands built this room. Enslaved hands carried the timber, mixed the mortar, applied the plaster. And enslaved hands cut through the beams that hold it aloft." "Let us dance," Cornelius announced. Let us celebrate. Let this evening mark the beginning of my daughter's happiness and the continuation of our family's legacy. The quartet resumed playing. Couples flooded back onto the floor. The chandelier swayed gently as vibrations traveled through the structure, the cumulative effect of hundreds of feet moving in rhythm, thousands of pounds shifting and settling and pressing down. At 9:40 p.m., Robert noticed the first sign. The chandelier's sway had changed. Not dramatically, but perceptibly. Instead of the gentle pendulum motion caused by air currents, it moved with a slight oscillation, a quiver, like a horse's flank twitching to dislodge a fly. The northern floor beam was beginning to fail. Robert's breathing remained steady. He positioned himself at the window center, hands resting on the sill, and waited. At 9:47 p.m., the crack sounded. Sharp. Distinct. Like a tree branch snapping in winter. Through the ballroom windows, Robert saw heads turn, saw conversation falter, saw the conductor's baton freeze mid-arc. The chandelier lurched, dropped 3 inches before catching again. Candle wax rained down onto the dancers below. A woman screamed. Panic rippled outward from that scream. Guests stumbled backward, creating a void beneath the chandelier even as they pressed toward the ballroom's 3 narrow doorways. But the exits couldn't accommodate the surge. Bodies compressed against bodies, silk tearing, voices rising in fear and confusion. Everyone remained calm. Cornelius bellowed from his platform. The structure is sound. The second beam failed. The eastern floor beam, embedded in the brick wall, supporting the ballroom's edge. The cut Robert had made 7 months ago finally surrendered. The sound was different this time, not a crack but a shriek, wood fibers tearing, the beam splitting lengthwise. The floor tilted. Only inches, but enough. Champagne flutes slid from tables and shattered against marble. The Meissen porcelain platters crashed. Women lost their balance, grabbed for partners, went down in tangles of silk and petticoats. Through his window, Robert watched the eastern wall bow slightly outward, the beam's failure allowing the floor to sag, to pull away from its moorings, to begin the cascade he'd engineered so carefully. The third floor beam went almost silently, a whisper deep within the western wall. But its failure triggered something catastrophic. The ballroom floor began to separate from its joists. Gaps appeared between the herringbone oak planks, first hairline, then finger wide. Through those gaps, guests could see down into the crawl space, into the darkness where Robert had spent so many Sunday mornings sawing. The floor, someone shrieked. The floor is giving way. The chandelier fell. Not completely, not yet. The primary chain snapped at its weakest link, and the massive iron fixture dropped 10 feet in a heartbeat before the secondary chain caught. It swung like a pendulum now, 300 candles streaming fire, crystal pendants shattering and raining down like glass tears. One pendant struck Prudence Ashfield's temple, opening her skin to bone. Blood on white marble, the first blood, but not the last. The stampede toward the exits intensified. Men shoved women aside. Women trampled the fallen. The doorways became killing zones, bodies crushed against doorframes, ribs cracking, fingers breaking as people clawed over one another in animal desperation. Thaddeus Ashfield abandoned all pretense of gentility. Robert watched through the window as the eldest son pushed aside an elderly woman, Mrs. Talmadge from Augusta, and she went down hard, disappearing beneath the press of bodies. Silas Ashfield clawed over the Meriwether family, his polished boot striking Hamilton's fiancée in the face. Constance Ashfield screamed for her father, her voice cutting through the chaos, but Cornelius had his own problems, pinned against the northern wall by a surge of guests, unable to move, his face purpling as the crowd compressed his chest. At 9:51 p.m., the first ceiling beam failed. The northern ceiling beam, the one bearing the greatest vault load, the one Robert had cut through in that second-floor storage closet. The sound was nothing like the floor beams. This was a roar, a bellow, as if the mansion itself had found voice and chosen to scream. The vaulted ceiling sagged at its center, the carefully constructed arcs bending downward, plaster cracking in spiderweb patterns that spread across the frescoed surface. Zeus's face split vertically. Aphrodite's body separated at the torso. The Greek gods came apart in sections, revealing the wooden lath beneath, the beams that were no longer beams but broken promises. The chandelier's secondary chain gave way. 300 candles, 500 pounds of iron and crystal, 20 feet of falling distance. It plunged into the mass of bodies below like a meteor, crushing the Meriwether daughters, Abigail and Sarah, 16 and 14 years old, beneath its weight. Their screams cut off instantly, replaced by the wet sounds of bodies breaking under impossible pressure. The fifth beam, the eastern ceiling support, failed within seconds of the fourth. Weight redistribution worked exactly as Robert had calculated. One beam's collapse forced the remaining beams to bear loads they were never designed to carry. The eastern beam twisted, fibers snapping in progressive sequence, 1,000 small failures becoming one catastrophic surrender. The sixth and final beam, the western ceiling support, held for 3 seconds longer than Robert had calculated. In those 3 seconds, some guests reached the doorways. Perhaps 15 people escaped into the mansion's foyer, stumbling and falling but alive, their evening gowns torn, their faces marked by terror and incomprehension. Then the final beam gave way. The entire vaulted ceiling came down as a single crushing mass. Plaster and lath and timber and the third-floor gallery, 200 tons of Georgian architecture transformed into a falling sky. The sound exceeded anything Robert had imagined, not just the roar of structural failure but the screams of 200 people caught beneath, the crack of bones breaking, the wet percussion of bodies being flattened by forces they couldn't comprehend. The eastern wall's windows exploded outward, unable to contain the pressure. Glass transformed into 1,000 glittering projectiles, catching candlelight as they flew, embedding themselves in flesh and wood and earth. A support column fell across Cornelius Ashfield's chest, pinning him to the floor. In the instant before it struck, Robert saw the plantation owner's face turn toward the carriage house window, saw recognition flash in those blue eyes, saw understanding arrive too late to matter. Cornelius Ashfield died knowing someone had done this deliberately. Silas Ashfield was impaled by a ceiling joist that fell point first, driving through his shoulder and into his chest cavity. He screamed for 11 seconds before blood filled his lungs and silenced him forever. Thaddeus Ashfield survived the initial collapse. Robert watched him emerge from the rubble, crawling over bodies, his tailcoat shredded, blood streaming from a scalp wound. He made it 3 feet before a secondary collapse, a section of third-floor gallery that had hung suspended momentarily, came down and crushed his spine. Constance Ashfield was trapped beneath a beam, her legs pinned, still alive, still screaming. Hamilton Meriwether III lay beside her, his skull crushed by falling plaster, his carefully groomed sideburns matted with brain matter. Prudence Ashfield had been standing near the refreshment table when the ceiling fell. A massive timber caught her across the shoulders, driving her to her knees. She lived for 7 minutes, crying out for Cornelius, for her children, for anyone to help her. But everyone who might have helped was either dead or dying beneath their own section of collapsed architecture. The ballroom still groaned and settled, timbers finding new positions, bodies being crushed by incremental shifts in weight. Dust filled the air, plaster dust, brick dust, the pulverized remains of Georgian aristocracy's finest evening. Candles that hadn't been extinguished by the collapse set small fires among the wreckage. The smell of burning silk mixed with blood and voided bowels and the copper tang of mass death. Robert stepped back from the window. The screaming continued, those still alive, those trapped but conscious, those bleeding out slowly beneath timber they couldn't lift. But the screams were fewer now, weaker, the sound of life draining away into Georgia clay. He walked to the corner of the carriage house and sat on his wooden stool. His hands returned to his lap, palms down, fingers spread. He thought of Delilah. He thought of Ruth. He thought of 214 days learning the mansion's architecture, 53 Sundays sawing through beams, 18 months of invisible rage transformed into visible catastrophe. He thought of the 237 guests who'd entered that ballroom. 63 were already dead. 48 would die from their injuries over the coming hours and days. The rest would carry scars, physical and psychological, for whatever remained of their lives. The Ashfield family was gone. All of them. Cornelius, Prudence, Thaddeus, Silas, Constance, crushed beneath the weight of their own hubris, their own certainty that the world existed to serve their pleasure. Robert had taken everything from them, just as they'd taken everything from him. Was it justice? Was it murder? Was it both? Neither, something beyond the vocabulary of morality that enslaved people were allowed to use? He didn't know. He didn't particularly care. Outside, people were beginning to realize something catastrophic had happened. Enslaved people emerged from their quarters, drawn by the sounds of collapse and screaming. Free workers from the gin house and the stable came running. They stood at a distance from the ruined mansion, staring at the eastern wing where the ballroom had been, where now only rubble and dust and death remained. No one approached the wreckage yet. The fires were still burning. The structure was still settling. And perhaps, on some level, everyone understood that this was a crime scene, that what had happened here wasn't an accident but an execution. Robert remained in the carriage house, sitting on his stool, waiting. He knew what came next. He'd known since the moment he made the first cut. Discovery. Investigation. Evidence that couldn't be concealed. His saw hidden in the carriage house rafters. The wood paste that wouldn't survive scrutiny. The saw marks on the beams that would tell their own story of premeditation and patience and revenge. He would hang for this. He'd known that from the beginning. But the Ashfield family would die first, and their death would echo through Georgia, through the South, through the entire architecture of slavery that depended on the belief that enslaved people lacked the intelligence, the will, the capacity for calculated violence. Robert Thorne had proven them wrong. Outside, the screaming finally stopped. What happened next shocked even those who discovered the truth. But before we get to the aftermath, subscribe and comment. I want to hear your reaction to what you've just learned. The first person to enter the ruins was William, the blacksmith, at 10:17 p.m. on October 12, 1827, 30 minutes after the collapse. He carried a lantern and moved cautiously through what had been the ballroom's eastern entrance, now a gaping wound in the mansion's brick facade. Behind him, a crowd of enslaved people and white overseers gathered in the yard, their faces illuminated by the fires still burning among the rubble. William stepped over a fallen beam and immediately recoiled. His boot had landed on something soft. In the lantern light, he saw it was Mrs. Abigail Merriweather's hand, severed at the wrist, still wearing 3 diamond rings. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, and the words carried across the silent crowd. The recovery operation began at dawn on October 13. Every able-bodied person on the plantation, enslaved and free alike, was pressed into service pulling bodies from the wreckage. They worked in shifts, forming human chains to pass timber and plaster and sections of the third-floor gallery out of the ruins. The work was gruesome, methodical, necessary. Cornelius Ashfield's body was found at 7:23 a.m., pinned beneath the support column that had crushed his chest. His face was frozen in an expression somewhere between rage and comprehension, as if in his final moment, he'd understood not just that he was dying, but why. Prudence Ashfield was discovered at 8:45 a.m., her body bent at an impossible angle, the massive timber across her shoulders having broken her spine and driven her ribcage into her lungs. Her fingers were worn bloody from clawing at the beam, trying futilely to free herself. Thaddeus and Silas Ashfield were found within 10 feet of each other, both recognizable only by their clothing and jewelry. The collapse had been particularly brutal to the brothers, Thaddeus crushed from the waist down, Silas impaled and broken like a discarded doll. Constance Ashfield took 9 hours to die. They found her still alive at 11:30 a.m. on October 13, trapped beneath a beam that had pinned her legs, conscious but delirious from blood loss and shock. It took 12 men 40 minutes to lift the beam enough to extract her. She was carried to an intact bedroom in the mansion's western wing, where a doctor from Milledgeville attempted to save her. He couldn't. The beam had crushed both legs beyond repair, severing arteries, pulverizing bones. She died at 6:47 p.m. on October 13, calling for her mother, who'd been buried that morning in the family cemetery. The final death toll was catalogued over 3 days, 63 dead within the first hour, 48 dead from injuries sustained during the collapse, 126 survivors with varying degrees of trauma. Every prominent family in Wilkinson County lost someone. The Meriwether family lost 5, both daughters, Hamilton 3, his father, and an elderly aunt. The Talmadge family from Augusta lost 7. The Flournoy family from Sparta was nearly extinguished, only one son survived, and he was left paralyzed from the waist down. Georgia had never seen anything like it. A single catastrophic event that decapitated the region's aristocracy in one evening. But catastrophe suggested accident. Tragedy suggested misfortune. What happened at Langridge Ashfield was neither. The discovery came on October 16, 4 days after the collapse, when structural engineers from Savannah arrived to investigate the cause. Cornelius's brother, Winston Ashfield, who'd inherited the estate by default, had hired them to determine whether the ballroom's construction had been faulty, whether the architect Lawrence Whitmore bore responsibility, whether lawsuits and insurance claims could recover some fraction of the devastation. The lead engineer, a methodical man named Edmund Carr, began by examining the beams that remained partially intact. The collapse had been so catastrophic that most structural elements were shattered beyond analysis, but 3 beams, or sections of them, had survived in recognizable form. Carr spent 2 hours examining the northern floor beam. At 2:37 p.m., he called for Winston Ashfield. "Sir," Carr said, his voice carefully neutral, "I need you to look at something." Winston approached, still dressed in morning black, his face hollow from 3 days of burying family members. Carr pointed to the beam with a measuring stick. "Do you see this?" Carr indicated a section of the beam where the wood paste had cracked away during the collapse, revealing the cut beneath. This beam didn't fail naturally. It was sawed. "Look at the marks, clean, deliberate, approximately 9 inches deep into a 12-inch beam." Winston stared. "Sawed? That's impossible. The beam was sealed behind plaster. No one could access it." "Someone did." Carr moved to the eastern floor beam, where similar evidence had been revealed. "This one too. 3/4 cut through. And here," he indicated the paste still clinging to the cut's edges. "Someone attempted to conceal it. This is wood shavings mixed with soot and fat, packed into the cut to make it invisible." Winston's face drained of color. "Are you saying someone sabotaged the ballroom?" "I'm saying someone systematically weakened every load-bearing beam supporting that structure. This wasn't a construction flaw or natural failure. This was deliberate, calculated structural sabotage designed to cause catastrophic collapse under maximum load." The investigation intensified immediately. Every beam fragment was examined. Every cut was measured, photographed, documented. The pattern emerged with undeniable clarity: 6 beams, each cut approximately 3/4 through, each cut concealed with wood paste, each cut positioned to remain invisible until the structure failed. The engineering required knowledge. The execution required access. The timeline required patience measured in months. Edmund Carr compiled his findings into a 30-page report delivered to Winston Ashfield on October 20. The conclusion was unambiguous: the Langridge Ashfield ballroom collapse was an act of premeditated architectural murder. Someone with detailed knowledge of the structure's load-bearing elements systematically compromised every critical beam over an extended period, timing the sabotage to coincide with maximum occupancy. This was not accident. This was execution. Winston shared the report with the Wilkinson County Sheriff, a heavy-set man named Tobias Whitlock who'd held the position for 15 years and had never investigated anything more complex than property disputes and minor thefts. He was utterly unprepared for architectural murder. But Whitlock was thorough. He interviewed every person on the plantation, starting with the white overseers and working through the enslaved population. Who had access to the mansion? Who understood construction? Who had the skills and opportunity to saw through oak beams? The answer became obvious within hours: Robert Thorne, the head coachman. Whitlock searched the carriage house on October 21. In the rafters of Robert's room, hidden behind a loose board, he found the crosscut saw. The blade showed signs of extensive use, microscopic wood fibers still caught in the teeth, despite obvious attempts at cleaning. A metallurgist from Augusta later confirmed the fibers matched the oak used in the ballroom's construction. In a trunk beneath Robert's bed, Whitlock found a small tin containing wood paste, the identical mixture of shavings, soot, and fat found in the beam cuts. In a hidden pocket sewn into Robert's mattress, Whitlock found drawings. Crude but accurate sketches of the ballroom's structural elements, with measurements and notes written in a careful hand. The drawings showed all 6 beams, their exact locations, their dimensions. Someone had mapped the architecture with precision, marked the optimal cutting points, calculated the sequence of failures. The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable, damning. Robert was arrested at 3:15 p.m. on October 21, 1827, 9 days after the massacre. He was found sitting on the stool in the carriage house, exactly where he'd been since the collapse, as if waiting for this moment. When Whitlock placed the shackles on his wrists, Robert spoke his first words since the ballroom fell: "I did it." No denial. No explanation. Just 3 words that confirmed what the evidence already proved. The trial, such as it was, occurred on October 27, 1827, in the Wilkinson County Courthouse in Milledgeville. Enslaved people had no right to jury trials, no right to legal representation, no presumption of innocence. The proceeding was administrative, a formality required to justify the execution that everyone knew was inevitable. Judge Bartholomew Hendricks presided. He was 68 years old, a plantation owner himself, a man who'd lost 3 friends in the ballroom collapse. His face was granite as he reviewed the evidence: the saw, the wood paste, the drawings, the engineer's report, Robert's confession. "Robert Thorne," Hendricks said, "you stand accused of murdering 111 people through deliberate structural sabotage. Do you understand these charges?" Robert stood in the defendant's box, still wearing his formal livery from the ball, now stained with 9 days of wear. His hands were shackled. His face was blank. "I understand," he said. "How do you plead?" "Guilty." The courtroom, packed with survivors, with families of the dead, with curious townspeople, erupted. Shouts for immediate hanging, for burning, for torture. Hendricks gavelled for silence. "The sentence is death by hanging," Hendricks announced. To be carried out on November 3, 1827, at the Langridge Ashfield estate, in view of the ruins you created. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court will not. Robert was returned to the county jail, where he spent 6 days in a cell awaiting execution. He received one visitor, Reverend Lawrence Blackburn, a white minister who'd served as the plantation's chaplain, who'd preached sermons about servants obeying masters, about the divine order that justified slavery. Blackburn entered the cell on November 1 and found Robert sitting on the stone floor, his back against the wall. "I've come to hear your confession," Blackburn said. "To help you make peace with God before you face judgment." Robert looked at him with eyes that held no fear, no remorse, no plea for spiritual intervention. "I don't need to make peace with God. God abandoned that plantation long before I did. You murdered over 100 people. I executed slave owners and their guests. There's a difference." Blackburn recoiled. "You feel no remorse?" "I feel what Cornelius Ashfield felt when he sold my wife and daughter to Mississippi. What Thaddeus felt when he whipped me for looking him in the eye. What Prudence felt when she worked Delilah 14 hours a day in that kitchen. Which is to say, nothing. That's blasphemy. That's honesty. You preached to us about heaven compensating for earthly suffering. You told us to forgive our masters, to turn the other cheek, to accept our bondage as God's will. I tried that for 34 years. It's a lie. The only justice in this world is the justice we make ourselves. Blackburn left without administering last rites. He would later tell people that Robert Thorne was irredeemable, that he showed no sign of Christian repentance, that his soul was lost to demons. But what haunted Blackburn, what kept him awake at night for years afterward, was the possibility that Robert was right. November 3, 1827, dawned cold and gray. A crowd of over 500 gathered at the Langridge Ashfield estate, survivors from the collapse, families of the deceased, plantation owners from neighboring counties, enslaved people from surrounding estates brought to witness the consequences of resistance. A gallows had been constructed in the yard, positioned to face the ruined eastern wing where the ballroom had stood. The symbolism was deliberate. Robert would hang in view of his crime, and the last thing he'd see before death would be the destruction he'd caused. Winston Ashfield read the charges and sentence. The crowd stood silent, breath misting in the November air. Robert was led to the platform, the noose placed around his neck. Sheriff Whitlock, serving as executioner, asked the condemned if he had final words. Robert looked out at the crowd, at the white faces twisted with rage and satisfaction, at the black faces carefully blank, revealing nothing in the presence of their masters. He looked at the ruined ballroom, at the pile of rubble that had been Georgian aristocracy's finest architectural achievement. Delilah Thorne, he said, his voice carrying across the silent yard. Ruth Thorne. Remember those names. They're worth more than everyone who died in that ballroom combined. The trap door opened at 10:07 a.m. Robert Thorne fell 6 feet and died instantly, his neck snapping cleanly. His body was left hanging for 3 hours as a warning, then cut down and buried in an unmarked grave at the edge of the plantation, away from the family cemetery where the Ashfields rested in expensive coffins. The Langridge Ashfield estate never recovered. Winston Ashfield attempted to maintain operations, but the massacre had broken something essential. Workers, both enslaved and free, refused to enter the ruined mansion. Productivity plummeted. The cotton crop failed in 1828, and again in 1829. By 1830, Winston had sold half the enslaved population to settle debts and was drinking himself to death in Savannah. The mansion stood abandoned. Local people claimed to hear sounds from the ruins, ballroom music, waltz melodies, the crystal chime of the chandelier's pendants. Screams on October nights. Footsteps in empty rooms. The scrape of a saw through wood. Whether these sounds were real or psychological didn't matter. The estate became cursed in the public imagination, a place where the natural order had inverted, where an enslaved man had destroyed his master so completely that even the land refused to forget. Winston died in 1833, childless, the last of the Ashfield line. The estate was auctioned to settle creditors, but no one bid. The property eventually reverted to the state of Georgia, which made no attempt to develop or resell it. It simply sat, accumulating kudzu and decay. In 1842, a Augusta businessman named Thaddeus Waverly purchased the property for $1,200, a fraction of its former value, intending to rebuild the mansion and establish a new plantation. He hired contractors, began clearing rubble, started laying foundations. On the third day of work, a laborer discovered something in the ruins, a section of the northern floor beam, the wood paste cracked away, the saw marks clearly visible. The cut was clean, precise, the work of someone who understood exactly what they were doing. The contractor showed Waverly the beam. "This proves the stories," he said. "Someone really did saw through the supports. This wasn't an accident or a construction flaw. This was murder." Waverly stared at the beam for a long moment. Then he walked off the property and never returned. The sale was voided. The estate remained abandoned. Over the decades, the mansion collapsed further. Roofs caved in. Walls tumbled. The white columns cracked and fell, one by one, until only fragments remained. The ballroom, or what had been the ballroom, became a crater of brick and rotted timber, filled with rainwater and shadows. But people still came. Not to rebuild or reclaim, but to witness. The Langridge Ashfield ruins became a pilgrimage site for the enslaved people of Wilkinson County, and later for their descendants. They came to stand in the place where Robert Thorne had proven that the masters were not invincible, that architectural knowledge could become a weapon, that patience and rage and intelligence could bring down empires. They came to remember Delilah Thorne. Ruth Thorne. The two names Robert had spoken before he died. The ruins still stand today, though "stand" is generous. It's mostly foundation now, crumbling brick, weathered timbers too rotted to identify. The Georgia Historical Society placed a marker there in 1963, site of the Langridge Ashfield Estate, 1809 to 1827. Destroyed in structural collapse, October 12, 1827. The marker makes no mention of Robert Thorne. No mention of sabotage. No mention of the 111 dead. It's a sanitized history, stripped of context and consequence, the kind of historical amnesia that makes atrocity palatable. But the locals remember. The stories persist. On October nights, people still claim to hear ballroom music drifting from the ruins. Still report seeing a figure in the window of a carriage house that no longer exists. Still feel the weight of something unresolved hanging in the air like humidity. In 2019, a team of structural engineers from Georgia Tech visited the ruins as part of a historical forensics project. They excavated several beam fragments, analyzed the saw marks, confirmed what Edmund Carr had documented in 1827, systematic sabotage, executed with remarkable precision over an extended period. One of the engineers, Dr. Patricia Chen, wrote in her report, "The level of architectural understanding required to accomplish this sabotage is extraordinary." Robert Thorne possessed knowledge equivalent to a trained structural engineer, despite having no formal education. He identified every critical load-bearing element, calculated failure sequences, and executed a plan that required 18 months of patient, invisible work. This wasn't mindless destruction. This was genius applied to vengeance. The report concluded, "The Langridge Ashfield collapse represents the most sophisticated act of resistance in American slavery history." Robert Thorne didn't just kill his masters, he demolished the architectural symbol of their power using the very knowledge they'd inadvertently given him by allowing him to observe construction. It's a case study in how oppression contains the seeds of its own destruction. The ruins remain. Kudzu has claimed most of the brick. Pine trees grow through the foundation. Wildlife nests in the spaces that once held Georgian aristocracy's finest evenings. But in the remaining beam fragments, the ones too embedded in earth to remove, too rotted to repurpose, the saw marks are still visible. Clean cuts, 3/4 through, the work of patient hands guided by brilliant calculation and justified rage. Stand in those ruins today. Place your hand on the cut wood. Feel the grooves where the saw bit into oak 197 years ago. And remember, Delilah Thorne. Ruth Thorne. Robert Thorne. Remember that resistance takes many forms. That knowledge is a weapon. That the enslaved were never the simple, docile laborers their masters imagined. That sometimes justice requires monstrous actions, and sometimes monsters are made by monstrous systems. Remember that on October 12, 1827, an enslaved coachman named Robert Thorne collapsed a ballroom roof and brought down everything the Ashfield family had built on the foundation of stolen lives. The mansion is gone. The family is extinct. The empire is dust. But the saw marks remain. Thank you for watching this haunting tale of Robert Thorne and the Langridge Ashfield Massacre. If stories like this fascinate you, subscribe for more macabre history, and let me know in the comments which dark historical event you'd like me to cover next. Until next time, remember, history's shadows hold the most chilling truths.